So I've personally reviewed over 1,000 digital companies for either my own personal acquisition or as an M&A intermediary. I've seen SaaS platforms, e-commerce stores, content, marketing agencies. I've seen brilliant entrepreneurs come in and pay 4x multiples for companies that collapsed within 18 months. And then I've watched smart buyers walk away from risky deals that would have made them millionaires. The problem is that most buyers evaluate and pre-assess companies completely wrong. They look at vanity metrics and they ignore really 5 big factors that will determine whether an acquisition is successful or not. So in this video, I'm going to use the exact framework that I use to separate the hidden gems from the disasters. And this is based on watching companies from listing all the way to 2 to 3 years post-acquisition. I remember a couple of years ago, I was looking at an amazing acquisition opportunity. It was a 7-year-old SaaS business generating about $180,000 in monthly recurring revenue, something like 20% month-over-month growth, and the asking price was $4.2 million, which was just under about a 2x. Everything looked amazing. The financials were clean, the growth was great, the team was optimized. It was this hockey stick growth, and the seller was motivated on top of it. So I had seen businesses sell for about a 4 or 5x of revenue, and the reason why I didn't pull the trigger was really just because of one thing that I'll dive into in a second. But I followed that business for about a couple of years, and 12 months after I looked at it, the business was losing money, and 18 months after I looked at it, it was on the verge of bankruptcy. So what happened was that the industry that the business in was on decline, and AI came around and started eating its lunch and stealing its customers. And after analyzing 1,000 businesses, there's really 5 major factors I want to talk to you about today that most buyers either ignore completely or they dramatically underweight in the pre-assessment process. So here's the exact framework that you can use to avoid devastating mistakes in the future. So mistake number 1, ignoring the industry tailwind test. Nobody talks about when evaluating digital companies that individual growth is great, but industry growth is everything. You can compare that previous story with another deal I saw during COVID. It was a 13-year-old e-commerce business. They sold ergonomic office furniture, and it only had about an 8% annual growth, but they were riding a massive tailwind. The remote work revolution was just kicking off. You know, that boring business doubled its revenue over the next 2 years, while that software business eventually died after about 2 years. So before you even look at the financials, ask yourself, is this an evergreen product or service in a growing industry? Because the best digital acquisitions combine 2 different things. 1, a product or service people need regardless of trends, it's evergreen, and it's in an industry with growth drivers, which are tailwinds. Examples of evergreen products and services with tailwinds would be health and wellness tools because of our aging population. Educational platforms is a good one because the skill-based economy is growing. And then financial services software for increasing complexity of the financial instruments we see today. Red flags to avoid would be industries facing regulatory pressure or products that solve temporary problems like fidget spinners. I've seen too many buyers get impressed with hockey stick growth in sunsetting industries. Do not be one of them. So mistake number 2, undervaluing business maturity. Older businesses are almost always better investments than younger ones, even when the younger ones are growing faster. Many buyers see a 2-year-old business growing at 30% monthly and they'll get mesmerized by the growth. Meanwhile, they'll dismiss a 10-year-old business growing 15% annually as, too mature. But what I discovered is that businesses under 5 years have a much higher chance of significant revenue decline within, 1 or 2 years post-acquisition. And companies with several years under their belt are more likely to have encountered, multiple types of issues, from economic issues to employee issues, market demand. And if they're still around after all those issues, it means they figured out how to solve them. And when they arise, again, they have the team, and the team has the experience to handle those issues for when you take over the business. If you're looking at a business that's 12 years old, that business would have survived the 2008 financial crisis, a million Google algorithm changes, the shift from desktop to mobile computers and mobile devices, COVID-19, and then iOS updates, and a million other things I'm probably not thinking of. But here's what to look for in a mature business. You want evidence that they've survived multiple industry changes, revenue streams that evolved over time, systems that show adaptability, and customer relationships that span years and not months. 10-year track record isn't boring or mature, it's proof of concept. Mistake number 3, forgetting the working capital reality. This is the acquisition killer that happens after you've already signed the papers. Many buyers obsess over whether they can afford the acquisition, the purchase price, and then and they completely ignore whether or not they can afford to actually run the business. Here's a terrible scenario I see repeatedly. A buyer scrapes together every dollar for, call it an $800,000 acquisition. He closes the deal, and then he discovers he needs another $150,000 in working capital just to keep the lights on and cover payroll and marketing expenses and anything else. And suddenly that affordable business becomes a cash flow catastrophe. I recently reviewed a deal where a buyer purchased an e-com business for $1.2 million. Great margins, great team, great growth trajectory, but he focused entirely on the purchase price and the financing and the seller note, and he completely overlooked the working capital. There wasn't enough inventory in stock to last the business long enough to get some cash flow in the door to buy another chunk of inventory. There wasn't enough cash on hand to pay for marketing expenses, and his new business suddenly became a cash flow nightmare. He ended up burning through his personal savings in just 2 or 3 months, and then he couldn't get additional financing because the business was already leveraged, and he had to start selling personal assets just to keep the business operating. That, great business nearly bankrupted him, not because it was a bad business, it was actually a really great business, but because he confused purchase affordability with operational affordability. So here's your working capital evaluation framework. 1, a 90-day cash flow test. Calculate how much cash the business needs for 90 days without any revenue coming in. Sometimes you need to purchase inventory before sales come in, or payroll needs to be paid before sales come in. It's just the reality of business. Make sure you have enough cash flow to operate the company for 90 days. 2, seasonal buffer analysis. Many businesses have seasonal patterns. E-commerce spikes during the holidays, B2B software sees slower summer months, and you need enough cash to weather those slow periods of time. The third thing is look at growth capital requirement. If you're buying a growing business, growth requires more cash, plain and simple. So more customers means more inventory or more staff, more systems. So factor in the cash needed to fuel your growth, or just accept that you might need to grow slower to preserve that cash. And another thing to consider would be the integration investment. Every acquisition requires some level of integration, process alignment, operational changes, and sometimes there's some client attrition. So when you're looking to buy a company, budget for a little bit extra cash during this transition period when efficiency or revenue temporarily drops or slows down. Start with the business's current working capital, add seasonal cash requirements, look at the monthly cash flow or P&Ls for the past couple of years. Whatever that largest negative cash flow month is, use that as your minimum buffer guide. And then you want to add in growth capital. If revenue is growing at 15% a year, you got to factor in that additional inventory and staff and operational cash needed to support that growth. And then plus you want to add in the integration costs. So add an extra 10 to 15% to cover integration expenses and any temporary loss of efficiency or attrition or things like that. So here are some working capital strategies. You can include it in your financing. You don't want to just finance the purchase price. You want to finance the total capital needed, the purchase price plus any working capital. Most lenders understand, and they would rather lend you enough money up front than watch you struggle when you owe them debt over the following years. Ask the seller to leave a certain amount of operational cash in the business. Frame it as it's to ensure smooth transition. You need gas in the tank, as opposed to I just can't afford to run this business, because sellers don't want to hear that either. Most successful acquirers have a simple rule. If you need to use every dollar you have to buy the business, you probably can't afford it. Working capital is not a nice to have part of acquisitions. It's the oxygen that your newly acquired business needs to breathe. It's the lifeblood of all businesses. So budget for it and negotiate for it. Your future self will thank you when you're investing in growth instead of fighting for survival, fighting to keep the lights on. All right, mistake number 4, ignoring owner dependency. This is the acquisition killer that nobody sees coming. You find a profitable, growing business, has great metrics, great team, you close the deal, and then you discover you didn't buy a business. What you really bought was some guy's job. So here's my owner dependency test that reveals this trap before you write the check. The 30-day test. Could this business operate for 30 days without the current owner ever touching it? And not just survive, actually operate at current performance levels or better. Then you have the decision tree test. How many daily decisions require the owner's personal input? If it's more than 2 or 3 decisions a week, again, it's a higher risk that you're buying a job and not a business. And you have the customer relationship test. What percentage of customers have a personal relationship with the business owner versus a relationship with the business or the team members? Anything over 10% is potentially very risky. And the last thing is the knowledge documentation test. Are the key business processes documented in a way that someone else could execute them? Or do they exist only in the owner's head? I reviewed this business that was $1 million one time, and the owner said he had these amazing systems, and when you looked at them, it was really just a Google Drive of a few templates and his personal Rolodex of contacts. You can compare that with a business that has every standard operating process documented, every customer interaction handled by team members, and then every decision had clear criteria and protocols. A business like the first one, where the owner is highly involved, might be a 2x business, but if a business has all these systems in place, it's going to be a 3 or 4x business, and it's definitely worth paying the extra money to buy that business. I think Warren Buffett says something along the lines of, I'd rather pay a fair price for a good business than a low price for a bad business. So here's what systematic businesses look like. They have standard operating procedures for every recurring task. They have team members that can handle 90% plus of all customer issues. They have documented decision-making criteria for common situations. And then they have performance metrics that don't depend on founder intuition. So if you're evaluating a business and the owner says, I'll stay on for 6 months to help with the transition, I mean, it's always nice to have, but that could also be a red flag, because great businesses don't need the founder to stay on for 6 months to show you the ropes. They should be able to provide you with 30 to 60 days of training, and the team can handle the business seamlessly when they leave. All right, mistake number 5 is ignoring customer concentration risk. This is the killer that I see destroys companies faster than any other risk. A lot of buyers look at total revenue and total number of customers, and they completely miss the distribution. And here's a story that highlights the risk associated with client concentration. Last week, I was analyzing the profit and loss statement of a potential client, and in 2023, the revenue was at $7 million. In 2024, the P&L showed that it dropped from $7 to $4.5 million. That's because their biggest customer, representing 35% of their total revenue, canceled their contract, and the business lost $2.5 million in annual recurring revenue almost overnight. That one cancellation dropped the business value by $3.5 million. You know, obviously, if you own the business and you're operating the business, you're not going to turn away large clients. But if you are buying a business, you don't want to buy a business that has any single client comprising more than 10 or so % of the total revenue. You know, client concentration risk also kills businesses in other ways that aren't always obvious. You have large clients think that they're critical to your business and they're going to demand special discounts and special terms. You sometimes can't make business changes that might upset your major customers, which then limit your growth opportunities. And of course, when you go to sell the business, buyers discount concentrated businesses heavily because they're inherently riskier for like exactly what I just explained in my story. So here's a customer concentration framework if you're looking to buy a business. It's the 50-25-10 rule. No single client or customer should comprise more than 10% of total revenue. The top 5 clients shouldn't exceed 25% of total revenue, and the top 10 should not exceed 50% of total revenue. And there's also the growth dependency test. Is the growth in the business coming from existing customers getting bigger or from acquiring new customers over time? Because growth from existing customers growing larger is much more fragile than adding more customers over time. Having single customers grow larger and larger and few customers being added on to the books also shows that the business does not have a good lead generation or marketing team or system in place, and they have a hard time getting new clients and customers, which is of course inherently more risky. And then you have the industry concentration test. Even if customers are individually small and spread out, are they all from the same industry? Because industry-wide downturns can wipe out seemingly diversified businesses. You can think about a business that has 1,000 customers and none of them represent more than 2 or 3% of revenue, which sounds like great concentration. But if 80% of those customers are all, let's say, real estate agents, and the real estate market softens or weakens and starts to decline, then maybe you can lose half of those customers in 3 to 6 month time. And there goes your business, right? So always remember to look for businesses with industry diversification among the clients and not just number of client diversification. So to recap, look for businesses where the largest customer represents less than 10% of revenue, top 10 comprise less than 25% of revenue, customers span at least 3 to 4 different industries, and new customer acquisition consistently replaces churn. Customer concentration is an easier fix than many issues, but only if you identify it before you buy the business. After you own the business, you're then stuck with that concentration risk until you can slowly diversify out of the situation. After looking at over 1,000 digital businesses, I've come to realize and learn that the best digital acquisitions are the ones brands that have figured out how to generate consistent profit from diversified customers in growing industries that don't depend on any single one person or system. So look for those types of businesses that have survived, systems that function without founders, and customer bases that can't disappear overnight. Every single factor I shared with you today is knowable before you write the check for business. The information is always there. You just need to know what questions to ask and which answers actually matter. The best digital acquisition you'll ever make is the one that's still growing your wealth a decade after you buy it. And that's it for today. So if you guys like the topic, you can click on my next video and we'll dive a little bit deeper into how to pre-assess digital companies before you spend your hard-earned money on them. That's it for now. See you next time. Thanks.